a living history production.
I'm Peter Hart.
And I'm Gary Bain.
And together we're Pete and Gary's Military History
Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. As ever, I'm Peter Hart. I've not changed my name for ages, Gary. And this is Gary Bain, who also hasn't changed his name. Hello. And today we're doing Hague at War, 1916. We've done loads of podcasts on Hague, and I hope people will listen to them. We started with his time as a young, tender young lad, and the Sudan. We went on to his time as a staff officer and equivalent of a brigade commander in the Boer War. His role as a senior staff officer and role in rebuilding the British Army and forming the territorial force. All this we did there, and then we followed his progress from 1914 and 1915, and now we've come to 1916. And what comes to your mind when I say the word 1916?
Well, for most, it's the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and that's all they think of concerning Hague. All they can see, a stark image of men marching bravely to their futile deaths, cut down in their thousands by mass German machine guns. They envisage the unimaginative generalship of bewhiskered old idiots safe in their chateau headquarters far behind the lines. Now, where was Hague?
He was in the chateau far behind the lines.
Well, of course he was. Where else could the GHQ, the BEF be? Although he did also have an advanced GHQ at a place called Beauquesne, I think, which was not far from Albert, behind Albert.
So not too far away, but they're still behind the line. His main headquarters was a small chateau. It's at Montreal, isn't it? And there's a big statue of him there, which I know the Douglas Haig Fellowship has been renovating. A very interesting project there.
Now, in his office, there was this huge match of the Western Front, which completely dominated the office, and an empty desk. Now that betrayed,
like you and me, Gary?
Absolutely, that betrayed his policy of clearing each day's work as it came.
I'm a bugger for that myself.
I'm exactly the same. Now, as the new commander of the BEF, and many people forget about that,
only appointed in December 1915.
Haig's capacity for sustained hard work was tested to the limit, and you're going to be Brigadier General John Charteris of the GHQ BEF.
Well, I don't like Charteris, so he's getting a full blood knock. At 8:30 precisely, Haig came into the mess for breakfast. He talked very little and generally confined himself to asking his personal staff what their plans were for the day. At 9 o'clock, he went into his study and worked until 11 or half past. At 11:30, he saw army commanders, the heads of departments at GHQ, and others whom he might desire to see. At 1 o'clock, he had lunch, which only lasted half an hour. And then he either motored or rode to the headquarters of some army corps or division. Generally, when returning from those visits, he would arrange for his horse to meet the car so that he could travel the last 3 or 4 miles on horseback. When not motoring, on the return journey from his ride, he would stop about 3 miles from home and hand over his horse to a groom and walk back to headquarters. On arrival there, he would go straight up to his room, have a bath, do his physical exercises. That's the wrong way round, Gary. Have you noticed that? Would you do your physical exercises before or after your bath? Or
during.
During your bath, yes. And then change into his slacks. From there until dinner time at 8 o'clock, he would sit at his desk and work. But he was always available if any of his staff or guests wished to see him. He never objected to interruptions at this hour. At 8 o'clock he dined. After dinner, which lasted about an hour, he returned to his room and worked until 10:45.
I thought you said you was going to do a strange voice.
Yeah, I couldn't. I just used my own instead.
Now, and so to bed. Now, this routine was very rarely broken. The visitors to Haig's headquarters were courteously treated, but some of them found his austere hospitality somewhat inhibiting. On one memorable visit, the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, was driven almost to distraction by his puritanical host. And once more, we take up the story with Brigadier General John Charteris.
Yeah, it's worth bearing in mind that Asquith his nickname was Squiffy Asquith. Why do you think that might have been? Was it
something to do with his squeaky shoes?
That's Squeaky Asquith. That's Squiffy. It was he was an alcoholic. Douglas Haig has some excellent old brandy, which, however, he only sends round once at each meal. After that, it stands in solitary grandeur in front of him on the table. The Prime Minister obviously appreciated it very much and wished for more, but he did not feel that he could ask for another glass. His method of achieving his aim
He's a pirate now.
was to move his glass a little nearer the bottle and then try and catch DH's eye and draw it down to the glass and then to the bottle. The glass advanced by stages as small as those of our attack until, last of all, was resting against the bottle. Then, overcoming all of his scruples, the Prime Minister, with a sweep of the arm, seized the bottle and poured out a glass. I was sitting opposite, and the byplay was indescribably funny. DH did not notice it at all. When I told it to him afterwards, his comment was, "If he has not enough determination to ask for a glass of brandy when he wants it, he should not be Prime Minister." Now, what do you think of that? I think this is a very revealing quote. Firstly, Charteris never seems to know what's going on. He thinks he does, but actually, Haig's the one who's spotted what's happening. If you can't ask for I think that's a very apposite quote by Haig. If he can't ask for another glass of brandy, he shouldn't be Prime Minister. He's clearly not up to the job. What do you think?
Can I just compliment you on your full range of accents?
I only missed out on my Australian lunatic.
It was incredible. Now, the responsibility on Haig's shoulders was truly immense. Hard working with a driving sense of duty, he was self-sufficient and he seemed on the surface to live only for the army. Although, in fact, he was also a devoted family man,
Yeah,
wasn't
there's
he?
been a lot of research done into this by a chap called George Webster. And he's revealed how much he was, A, besotted with his wife, and B, cared for his children. He'd make sure they had Christmas presents and things like that. But he took a real interest in what was happening to them.
No,
I also interviewed his son.
I don't know how he got on as a general because he was unfailingly polite and even-tempered. Now,
That doesn't sound like any general we know.
he possessed an equable temperament that did not betray any trace of panic or temper, no matter how grim the state of affairs at
I'm
the
sorry,
front.
Jack, I don't believe it.
I don't believe that.
He's a sort of chap. He's not really interested in an expression of opinion, is it? It doesn't really, what does he want?
He wants reasoned arguments based on facts, and he wants that before making any decision. He had a deep and abiding confidence in his own powers of judgment, and he would not revisit decisions already taken unless new evidence was brought before him.
Now, we've both had experience on committees, and how many times do you sit in a committee and you revisit something, but there's nothing new? You just go retreading the argument. Is there any point of that?
No, none at all. Not if the information's the same. The conclusion surely is going to be the same.
I think the fact that Haig needs hard facts and then makes a solid decision that he won't revisit, he won't chop and change his plans.
No, and you shouldn't be surprised by that because, he's committing his men to battle and he wouldn't arbitrarily chop and change his best laid plans that he'd work hard on all day and all night, every day in the cause of his country, for which the men he commanded, let's face it, were being asked to risk their lives.
Well, risk it and lose, yeah, definitely. Now, he was working in tandem with someone, and that someone is another figure that we both like. Who was he working with? Who was the new Chief of Imperial General Staff? Imperial generals, yeah.
I'm assuming you mean General Sir William Robertson.
Oh, hero.
Willie.
Yeah. Willie, yeah. Now, what do these two men have in common?
Well, they were both, and we agree with this.
Absolutely.
Westerners. That's men who made it their business to discourage or stamp out all schemes which they considered diluted the war effort in the only place where it really mattered, on the Western Front. Yeah,
well, because to them and to us, it's self-evident. Germany is the beating heart, Gary, the beating heart, as opposed to me who gets beaten. Without Germany, Austria-Hungary and Turkey, Bulgaria as well, when it comes into war, there is nothing. They would collapse. And you couldn't defeat Germany until her armies had been defeated in the field. And where would that have to be? It could have been on the Eastern Front by the Russians, but it wasn't. Where would it have to happen, really? Where?
It had to happen on the Western Front. Haig succinctly summarised his policy in his diary.
You're going to be General Sir Douglas Haig at GHQ.
The principles which we must apply are: 1. Employ sufficient force to wear down the enemy and cause him to use up his reserves. 2. Then, and not till then, throw in a mass of troops, at some point where the enemy has shown himself to be weak, to break through and win victory.
Now, this isn't rocket science, is it? It's standard British Army Staff College thinking. But it's not what actually happens, because both Haig and Robertson, they see there's no easy option, no magical... politicians, politicians. When you work for TfL, what do politicians always want?
More.
A magical route. But they just want an easy solution. They always go the easy way, don't they? But what do Haig and Robertson have in common?
Well, they're both perhaps unimaginative men. They were definitely ruthless when required, but above all, they're hard, practical men, and they, frankly, were entirely right.
I think so, yeah. So now, what's changed about the British Army compared for when Sir John French took command of the BEF in 1914? What's happened by the end of 1915 when Haig takes over?
Well, it's considerably increased in stature, with some 38 infantry divisions deployed on the Western Front by January 1916.
As opposed to 4, a couple of cavalry divisions, and then 2 more reserve divisions arriving.
So that's nearly 1 million men, frankly, I think.
By January 16, yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? And what else is there? It's not just the British.
No, the peoples of the then Empire had also put their shoulder to the wheel. You had Indians, Australians, New Zealanders and Canadians all flocking to the colours, and plans were afoot to send a further batch of new army and territorial divisions to the front before the summer of 1916.
There were also plans to bring over some of the Gallipoli divisions. Of course, Gallipoli had been finally evacuated in January of 1916.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah. So, now... who do you think is looking on this with a somewhat jaundiced eye?
Well, from a French perspective, it was 2 years too late, but the British had finally managed to mobilise a force commensurate in size with the inherent potential of the massive British Empire.
Now, was Haig a master of his own destiny with this massive new force?
No, as we've covered off, in a previous podcast, the Minister of War, Lord Kitchener, he'd specifically ordered him to cooperate with the French army as a united army, whilst at the same time maintaining his independence of command.
I wonder if Kitchener's becoming a bit more political.
And once more, I'm going to be General Sir Douglas Haig. I am not under General Joffre's orders, but that would make no difference, as my intention was to do my utmost to carry out General Joffre's wishes on strategical matters, as if they were orders. Now, that's a very, very clear definition there.
Not tactical.
Strategic matters.
Not tactical. He's not going to be told how he attains a village or something, but he's going to be told the big themes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, who is the dominant force on the Western Front? Well, on the Allied side, it's the French, isn't it? What size are they by then?
Well, they're some 95 infantry divisions in early 1916.
That's bigger than 36.
Yeah, and then when the 6 Belgian divisions were added into the equation, there's some 139 Allied divisions on the Western Front.
Now, who decided the overall strategy then? Who is the man in... it's Joff, isn't it? French Commander-in-Chief, Joseph Joff. Now, why is this a complicated situation? What's happened? I mean, when had the plan been decided?
Well, most of it had basically been agreed with Haig's predecessor, General Sir John French. The Allies were trying to negate the Central Powers' advantage of internal communications by launching a joint Anglo-French offensive on the Western Front in concert with simultaneous offensives from Russia and Italy.
So it's basically to pound the Germans from all sides. It's not subtle or sophisticated, but it's probably the best way. And where had Joff... we covered all this in the planning for the Somme, so this is quick. Where did Joff decide they should attack?
Well, it's basically where the two armies are joined, which is by the River Somme in Picardy in the summer of 1916. While the French launched an attack south of the Somme, the British would attack north of the river.
Now, Haig had no choice but to fall in with this. I mean, because it's the French decision. Success on the Somme doesn't offer any strategic objectives to anybody. You can go 50, 60 miles in either direction. But where did Haig favour an offensive?
Haig favoured an offensive in Flanders, and in fact later in the year. But in the end, he's willing to fall in line with Joffre's plan for the sake of the alliance.
Yeah, I mean...
as per his instructions.
And Flanders, there are strategic objectives, but not. He doesn't have a choice. Now, is there somebody else involved in deciding what would happen on the Western Front? So there's Haig and there's Joff. Who else is responsible? Well, and in a lot of books, you wouldn't know this, would you?
Yeah, well, the Germans, they're too. And they're more than capable of making and carrying out their own plans. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the Chief of the General Staff, had a somewhat pessimistic view of the overall German strategic position.
Oh, I think we think he's right, by the way. We thought that after the Battle of the Marne in 1914, ultimately the Germans are pretty well buggered, to use a very technical term.
Now, he develops a plan for a new offensive against the French, which was designed to capitalise on the, listen to this figure, 1,430,000 casualties already inflicted on the French nation.
Trying to knock them out of the war.
Yeah. Now, he launches a stunning assault on the fortress of Verdun on the 21st of February 1916.
Yeah, well, that's it. It's something close to the French heart. They will do almost anything to keep it, and it develops into an enormous attritional battle, and the French can no longer play the major part. Although they can play an important part in the Battle of the Somme. And gradually Joff comes to see the Somme as a way of relieving pressure on Verdun rather than this grand strategic vision of defeating the Germans. Well, now, we covered the French contribution on the Somme with a podcast. Do you remember that one?
It was with Dave O'Malley, and it showed the French contribution was still important and effective.
More effective in some ways than the British.
Yeah, and indeed they suffered something like 200,000 casualties, I think.
Now, what was Haig's approach in 16?
Well, he was very cautious because, in his opinion, his men were by no means adequately trained for the shock of battle. And he puts it rather bluntly, Pete, and once more, I'm going to be General Sir Douglas Haig. I have not got an army in France, really, but a collection of divisions, untrained for the field. The actual fighting army will be evolved from them.
Now, this is very interesting because I think he's right. They just hadn't had chance. I mean, some of them had battle experience, but they had not got offensive battle skill. But the French, they're desperate, aren't they? And Joff wants urgent British action. And by the way, the clock's been ticking for them for 2 years with the British getting their arses in gear. So what are Haig's real intentions in launching the Battle of the Somme? He hoped to achieve victory in 1916. Of course he did. But he's aware that it might not be possible. And you're again going to be Douglas Haig.
My policy is briefly to 1. Train my divisions and collect as much ammunition and as many guns as possible. 2. To make arrangements to support the French attacking in order to draw off pressure from Verdun when the French consider the military situation demands it. But while attacking to help our allies, not to think that we can for a certainty destroy the power of Germany this year. So in our attacks, we must also aim at improving our positions with a view to making sure of the results of the campaign next year.
That's 1917. So I think this is a reasoned position. The British... And another thing to have forgotten is, people going about Waterloo, that's not a British army, that's an Allied army. This is the first time the British are going to fight a real continental battle in modern war against the main enemy, the Germans, on the decisive front, the Western Front. Now, have we mentioned the Somme in any of our previous podcasts, Gary?
Yeah, we dealt with much of the Somme battles in a series of podcasts, which you can listen on Pete and Gary's military history. So we'll just examine some key themes.
Hague and some key themes. What's first then?
Well, Haig was not responsible for the tactics employed, although he did make suggestions. For example, Haig favoured the hurricane bombardment.
As at Neuve-Chapelle, when he was First Army Commander.
Now, that wasn't really feasible, given the number of guns and ammunition it would require.
Well, because of the width of the front, you mean?
Yeah. Now, as the wire had to be cut, with the only means of doing so being shrapnel shells, then a preliminary bombardment of some 7 days was required.
So, in essence, because later in the war they have 106 instant, they can use high explosive and instant detonation fuses, but that's not been invented, or not been produced then. Now there's another theme that we want to look at in the Somme battles. What did Haig want? He wanted to maximise the potential advance or gains in any major attack. And in doing so, he sort of calls for an attack on the German second line system. And I want to make this clear, not the second line system. There are 2 or 3 systems on the Somme, as well as the first. And this is a repeated frame, but it's particularly noticeable because of what happens on the 1st of July. And you're going to be Haig explaining how he reacted to Rawlinson's plans.
I studied Sir Henry Rawlinson's proposals for attack. His intention is merely to take the enemy's first and second system of trenches and kill Germans. He looks upon the gaining of 3 or 4 kilometres, more or less, of ground immaterial. I think we can do better than this by aiming at getting as large a combined force of French and British across the Somme and fighting the enemy in the open.
Now, Haig is a contingency planner, and one thing that people miss is that in his plans, he's always looking at a variety of options as to what happens. He was a staff officer par excellence. He always fears that caution means missed opportunities if the German front line shows any signs of collapse at any point. But he's not for bite and hold. Now, what is bite and hold? You can just briefly explain that for us.
Well, it's exactly what it says. It's taking a bite out of the German line, holding it, because what do the Germans always do?
Counter-attack. So you need your artillery to do that.
And it's limited objectives. So what Haig's proposing is an attempt at an outright breakthrough. He'd been seduced, I think, Pete, by the potential of massed artillery, as demonstrated at least in part by the early German operations at Verdun.
There's something else. I think, because we're Haigista, as they sometimes call it, but I think Haig was wrong. I do think at the time of the war that bite and hold was the answer in 1916. Not the answer in the war, that's the All-Arms Battle of 1918, which was impossible in 1916.
And as we've said it on a number of occasions, if you include the second line system as an objective, you've got to include that in the prior bombardments. And unless the amount of artillery is increased,
which it wasn't,
it's plain that every shell you fire into the German second line trenches and the wire that would bar their way was one less fired at the German first line, which, after all, has to be overcome before the advancing troops can make any progress at all.
So in a sense, in trying to do too much, you risk doing nothing at all. Now, what if they broke through? Now, this is another theme. Haig always has his eye on using cavalry. But this is again contingency planning. Also, the one thing to remember is it's his only mobile exploitation force. There was nothing else. And even when tanks are invented, which they are, during the Somme battle.
15th of September 1916.
Well done, Gary.
Thank you.
That wasn't when they were invented, that's first use.
That's first use at Fleurs. So he can't use anything else, is the point that we're trying nobly to make.
Yeah, we are trying to make that point nobly. And you're going to be Haig and just say, he explains about cavalry. He says this.
I told him to impress on his corps commanders the use of their corps cavalry and mounted troops, and if necessary, supplement them with regular cavalry units. In my opinion, it is better to prepare to advance beyond the enemy's last line of trenches, because we are then in a position to take advantage of any breakdown in the enemy's defence, whereas if there is a stubborn resistance put up, the matter settles itself. On the other hand, if no preparations for an advance are made till the next morning, we might lose a golden opportunity.
Contingency planning. And you recognise that from your own career. Contingency planning is important. You can't just
I was going to say marriage.
Yes, you've always had a contingency. Divorce. Living alone in misery. With Fred.
Yes.
The one other thing, I mean, Haig, what is something that is important to Haig, although he's given very little credit to it, because of course he appoints other people to do it. What is Haig interested in?
Well, he's urging the necessity to accelerate the training of the divisions under his command. It's a matter of increasing importance.
Why? Why, Gary?
Well, the British Army began to realise the seriousness of sending in half-trained infantry against experienced German units occupying superbly fortified defensive positions. I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh at that, but that's just so obvious.
Yeah. Well, a lot of things are obvious, but you have to, it's a matter of grip. You have to make the time to have the training, which means it's not as easy as it says. And does this become of more or less importance?
No, it becomes an ever-increasing importance to the BEF.
From 16 onwards through to 18, yeah.
And you've got to also, finally, understand...
Let's reiterate it, because it's important. I know what you're going to say. We're going to reiterate the overall point.
Yeah, it's important to understand the infantry tactics were not based on Haig's orders. These were tactics under the control of army, corps and divisional commanders.
Now, however, tactically, I think there's one huge mistake Haig makes. And now this is a matter of opinion, and that's all it is. And I know that different historians have taken different viewpoints of this, although some of the lesser ones haven't even considered it. But the likes of Jack Sheldon have really brought this to our attention. Let's go through it. The end of the first day, they've gained ground in the south, Gary. Remember?
Yeah.
And they've done well. And the French have done really well. But in the south, the really significant ridge, the Byzantine ridge, is still guarded by the German second-line system. But what happens in the north, Gary?
Well, in the north, the assault on the key Schwerpunkt of Thiepval Spur...
What's a Schwerpunkt?
And Bossier's Ridge had utterly failed.
It's
a strong point, the Schwerpunkt.
It's the key point, and this is Jack Sheldon's point, isn't it? It's the most important tactically point on the battlefield, and it is defended, as you rightly say, by a strong point, in this case, a Schwaben redoubt and the rest of it. So had that succeeded? No. What did you say? It utterly failed.
Now, success there would have provided vital observation over large sectors of the German defensive system.
Would that have destabilised them a bit?
Absolutely. It had destabilised the whole German line in the Somme sector. They failed where it mattered.
In the north?
And succeeded where it was all but tactically irrelevant.
In the south?
Yes.
Oh dear. Now, this leads there's a quandary here. So there's two ways. You renew the attack in the south and capitalise on success. But what does that mean? Well,
you're still going to have to capture Thiepval and Pozières at some point before you could make any sort of rapid advance.
Now, But attacking Thiepval and Pozières, what did that mean? What might you incur if you attack them again?
Well, you're gonna suffer huge losses, aren't you? You'd already suffered a scale of losses that was difficult to understand and believe. But it called to mind the wisdom of hitting their heads against a brick wall as a means of progress.
So it's difficult. Now there's two. This is controversial, and even at the time there were different approaches. What did Rawlinson?
General Sir Henry Rawlinson, to give him his Sunday name, was inclined to grasp the bull by the horns and to batter down the continued resistance in the north before turning to exploit the success gained in the south. And you're going to be General Sir Henry Rawlinson of the HQ 4th Army.
A large part of the German reserve have now been drawn in, and it is essential to keep up the pressure and wear out the defence. It is also necessary to secure, as early as possible, all important tactical points still in the possession of the Germans in their front-line system, an intermediate line, with a view to an ultimate attack on the German second line. So a balance of probability there is that he'd prefer to have another go at the really tactically significant points in the north.
Yeah, I mean, he felt they'd have to catch up, as it were, by taking their original objectives along the Thiepval Spur and Pozieres Ridge before the next real assault designed to penetrate the German second line.
Second line system, yeah, that's right.
All along the original front.
Yeah. Now, Haig takes an alternative tactical approach. What does he want to do?
Well, he wants to push ahead in the south alongside the French to build on success that's already been achieved. However, this infuriates the French.
Why would that infuriate the French? Well, you're going to find there's a meeting between Joff and Haig on the 3rd of July, and there's a famous quote which you're going to be Sir Douglas Haig, and I think this is Haig's greatest mistake. And funnily enough, it's a rare moment when Haig is quite arrogant about it, I think Haig's wrong.
Joffre began by pointing out the importance of our getting Thiepval Hill. To this, I said that in view of the progress made on my right, near Montauban, and the demoralised nature of the enemy's troops in that area, I was considering the desirability of pressing my attack on Longueval. I was therefore anxious to know whether in that event the French would attack Guillemont. At this, General Joffre exploded in a fit of rage. He could not approve it. He ordered me to attack Thiepval and Pozieres. If I attacked Longueval, I would be beaten, etc., etc. I waited calmly till he had finished. His breast heaved and his face flushed. The truth is, the poor man cannot argue, nor can he easily read a map.
Oh dear, oh dear. Now, this is not Haig's greatest hour. Joff is saying you've got to capture the Thiepval Spur and Pozieres Ridge, and it doesn't matter what extra casualties you get. He's also deeply suspicious of the British. Why?
Well, he thinks that in switching the balance of the attack to the south, he feared the French army might once again end up bearing the brunt of the fight.
Well, Haig wants them to attack Guillemont, doesn't he? And so he's wanting a bigger contribution from the French. It's not going to help with the Verdun if the French are going to be drawn deeper and deeper.
No, absolutely. It doesn't. It negates any advantage that they receive at Verdun.
Now, Haig, eventually, he braves Joff's wrath. He will accept strategic control in a joint allied cause, but he will not accept tactical interference. And Rawlinson, what happens to Rawlinson?
Well, he's also overruled.
Well, of course he is, because he's only a general. They would attack in the south with the intention of securing good positions from which you can make a big thrust to break through the German second-line system on the Byzantine Le Petit Ridge, which is what they do on the 14th of July. Now, the trouble is that Haig's wrong, because where was the Schwerpunkt?
Well, the Schwerpunkt was, as you mentioned earlier, the Schwaben Redoubt, and Jack Sheldon would say so, the naughty Germans would say so, and even you would say so.
I would, and I didn't understand this when I wrote my book, but that was in 2006. Historians do learn, and people like Jack Sheldon have taught us, and the Schwerpunkt was that. It was the ground there was crucial. And what happened when we eventually take it?
Well, the ground's taken later in the campaign, and the German line was indeed destabilised. Perversely, many normally critical commentators have praised Haig for this stance.
Yeah, the idea being that he would... it's often been seen that Haig would... And I must admit, I did used to think that Haig was right because he was capitalising on success rather than banging his head against a brick wall. It's really interesting. I do not find it fascinating that this isn't a clear-cut issue, is it?
No, and it would have been even less so on the ground in 1916.
So a mistake by Haig, I think. Another mistake. So I think his not using bite and hold on the first day was a mistake. And then I think this is a bigger mistake in some ways. No, there's a second. I'm sorry. You see, this is the point. You can admire Haig, but point to things that go wrong. What else would you say is a little bit awry with Haig's performance during the battle?
Well, it's the lack of grip by Haig and Rawlinson during the battles.
Both of them?
Yeah, both of them.
So Haig doesn't grip Rawlinson, and Rawlinson doesn't grip his...
No, once the responsibility's been devolved down to the corps and divisional commanders, each went their own way in planning the actions in the area for which they're responsible, and that's not right.
No, and what happens is you get attacks are planned in isolation, and corps attacks get devolved down to divisions, and they assign it to a brigade who say, "Oh right, well, the 15th sausages can do it," and you get a single battalion attack, and sometimes it devolves right down to just a company, and it's meant to have been a big attack, and it ends up just being a battalion walking into no man's land. And what happens to them?
Well, they're truly futile, aren't they? And there's no sense of coherence or guiding hand, and it's never going to succeed. It's just impossible.
There's no sense of a guiding hand going on. I mean, the bigger themes are, you've got to take up these local objectives before we can make the bigger attack on the German second line system, but it doesn't come through. There's no coordination. And what's Haig doing? He's lecturing Rawlinson, but
the doomed attacks carry on anyway.
So Haig isn't gripping Rawlinson, and Rawlinson isn't gripping his corps and divisional commanders.
So they're doomed to failure.
Yeah. Another theme, and this is common to the army in most times. So, what would you say is common to most generals in the First World War or any war?
Well, it's the backstabbing bastards in London.
Gary!
Or politicians, as they're otherwise known.
Well, I'm absolutely appalled at that, but it's true, isn't it?
It is. By the end of July, the politicians in London are becoming increasingly edgy as to the lack of visible progress on the ground on the Somme.
Well, from their perspective, let's just be for a moment fair to them before we stab them ourselves. They see the enormous sacrifices that the Empire's making, and they want some clear, visible results, other than just it's a bit intangible saying, well, we've relieved pressure on Verdun. Is that, who would you imagine was one of the most vigorous and loudest critics?
The word you might be struggling for, Pete, there is trenchant critics.
I was avoiding that word.
Oh, well, that's Winston Churchill. He returned to his parliamentary duties after his brief period of service on the Western Front.
Heroic period of that we always have to worship, when he was briefly in command of a battalion and the quietest sector of the British front. Yes.
Which was his penance for the Gallipoli debacle.
What a penance.
That he and others had initiated.
Yeah. Well, he wasn't alone in that, yeah. So what's he doing now?
Well, he argued, Churchill that is, argued his case in a confidential memorandum which was circulated to the War Cabinet. Having stressed the serious nature of the British casualties and the failure to gain ground, he bluntly questioned the purpose of continuing the offensive. And, rather amusingly, you're going to be Winston Churchill MP.
I can't do a Churchill voice, I'll just use me. The month that has passed has enabled the enemy to make whatever preparations behind his original lines he may think necessary. He could quite easily by now have converted the whole countryside in front of our attack into successive lines of defence and fortified posts. What should we have done in the same time in similar circumstances? Anything he has left undone in this respect is due only to his confidence. A very powerful hostile artillery has now been assembled against us, and this will greatly aggravate the difficulties of further advance. Nor are we making for any point of strategic or political consequence. He's right there about the Somme, that I'm not denying that. He goes on, Verdun at least would be a trophy to which sentiment on both sides has become mistakenly attached. But what are Peronne and Bapaume, even if we are likely to take them? Well, the ultimate result of the Somme, I would remind you, is although they're not taken in the fighting, the destabilisation of the German line means they withdraw way past it in February, March 1917. So how does Haig defend himself?
Well, Haig vehemently defends the achievements on the Somme offensive so far in a note to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir William Robertson. And this, in turn, is later printed as a cabinet paper to refute Churchill's arguments.
And you're going to be Sir Douglas Haig, and you're going to go through some of his reasoning.
A. Pressure on Verdun relieved. Not less than 6 enemy divisions besides heavy guns have been withdrawn. B. Successes achieved by Russia last month would certainly have been stopped had enemy been free to transfer troops from here to the Eastern Theatre. C. Proof given to the world that Allies are capable of making and maintaining a vigorous offensive and of driving enemy's best troops from the strongest positions has shaken faith of Germans, of their friends, of doubting neutrals in the invincibility of Germany. D. We have inflicted very heavy losses on the enemy. In 1 month, 30 of his divisions have been used up, as against 35 at Verdun in 5 months. In another 6 weeks, the enemy should be hard put to find men. The maintenance of a steady offensive pressure... This is E. E. The maintenance of a steady offensive pressure will result eventually in his complete overthrow. I suspect to be able to maintain the offensive well into the autumn. It would not be justifiable to calculate on the enemy's resistance being completely broken without another campaign next year.
Oh, I think that's quite reasoned arguments. I mean, some of it is special pleading, but I like the next bit because he also follows it up with a bit of a personal dig at Churchill. And I think that this is what makes me suspect that he wasn't quite as even-tempered and not bad, not general-like. You're going to be Haig. What does he say as?
We must not allow them to divert our thoughts from our main objective, namely beating the Germans. I also expect that Winston's head is gone from taking drugs.
Does he mean aspirin? Oh dear. During the Somme, we've referred to this in our podcast, but it's such a major theme we've got to refer to it again. What is one of the great problems of the campaign that becomes more and more evident?
Well, careful preparation's a two-edged sword. Time to prepare for an assault was also time for the Germans to repair and prepare their defences. Time to bring up fresh divisions and more gun batteries to duel with the British artillery for the control of the battlefield.
Because a lot of it's about the guns, isn't it?
Yeah, but if to attack without proper preparation would simply guarantee defeat, as had happened time and time before.
That's so. How? I mean. Yes, well, I can see a problem here. So if you don't attack straight away, the enemy gets stronger, and if you do attack straight away, you're not prepared. So I can't see a way through that. So what's the concept that results?
Well, the concept that's introduced is the wearing out battle. That's a fairly classical military tactical philosophy, which considered that most battles resolved themselves into a fight to wear down the frontline troops and reserves of the enemy, whilst reserving a strike force to be launched into decisive action at the critical moment of the battle.
So I'd say like Waterloo, that'd been a matter of hours, 5 or 6 hours.
Yeah, exactly. But given the strength of the armies involved on the Somme and the sheer scale of the fighting, it now seemed that phase would last for weeks.
Or months.
Yeah, possibly. Now, that's an awful prospect, but Haig had the dour determination to see the job through.
So that's a plus sign, because Haig does have the determination to do it. I mean, he just doesn't give up, does he? Now, in some ways, the Battle of the Somme, as you know, climaxes at which battle, Gary?
Well, it's the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on the
When was that, Gary?
15th of September 1916.
Now, you've got another quote from Haig, who's looking at the situation around about this time. It's quite a long quote, but I think again it reveals what Haig's thinking as the fighting goes on in 16.
During the 2 months that the Battle of the Somme has lasted, the enemy has suffered repeated defeats and heavy losses, and has undergone many hardships. All this has undoubtedly told on his discipline and morale, and signs of deterioration in his troops are not wanting. The general offensive on all his fronts, which will be continued, has placed a great and prolonged strain on his power of resistance, which strain will now be increased by the entry of Romania into the war. The reserves at the enemy's disposal to meet a renewed attack are very limited and consist mainly of tired troops which have already suffered severely. Moreover, it is not unlikely that he will be compelled to transfer some of his reserves to his eastern front. the combined attacks to be launched by the French and British troops during the first week of September, and the counterattacks by the enemy that are likely to result, will weaken him further and wear down the divisions now opposed to us. On our side, several fresh divisions are still available to be thrown into the scale after these combined attacks have been carried out. We shall also have a new weapon of offence, some 50 tanks, which, coming as a surprise to the enemy, are likely to be of considerable moral and material assistance to us. In short, we are approaching a stage in the battle when bold and energetic action may give great, perhaps decisive, results, provided the requisite preparations are made in time and all ranks put forth their utmost efforts.
Now, this is the September view, and the battles are quite dramatic, and the British Army is learning. It's not exactly the all arms battle at all, but they are making progress. But in the end, what's the essential theme of Flers Courcelette, the battles that follow in September and early October? What do the Germans do?
Well, the Germans, it's not, contrary to Hague and the hammer blows of the previous months, they seem to be bearing fruit at last. I have no idea what you're asking me.
Well, they hold on.
Oh, I see. Sorry. So, yeah, but why did they hold on? You know, the tanks were useful.
Nothing more.
But not decisive.
More. Who's the father of the tank corps?
Oh, we've said this previously. We think it's Haig.
Why? They don't, the tank corps, but they're
well, he's the first to see the potential, and he orders 1,000, without knowing whether or not they were going to be successful.
Yeah. And they are useful. Now, so it's moving deeper and deeper into autumn. They're not going to abandon the offensive because Haig, what Haig thinks he
thinks that the attacks are seeming to bear fruit at last. There's some indication that the German resistance could win.
Now, this is that idiot Charteris. A lot of this is dodgy intelligence, which Charteris continually feeds to Haig.
Yeah, I mean, he's suggesting there's a tantalising possibility that the Germans might at long last be on the very verge of collapse.
Now, this is interesting because, of course, Haig had fought...
If you'd have asked me that, I'd have been able to answer.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. If Haig... I'll ask you something else you won't know the answer to. When had Haig been in a defensive battle that where it seemed as if the Germans would break through if they'd only attacked one more day or 2 more days?
I don't know.
First Ypres. Do you remember when it was so...
1914, Haig did very, very well.
And the Germans seemed as if they were going to break through. And Haig always thought if they'd just attacked a bit more, they would have broken through, although we know that the French were coming to the British rescue. So that's... Haig always thinks that just one more blow will go through, doesn't he? Anyway, so what does Haig say about this sort of feeling?
We'd already broken through all the enemy's prepared lines, and that now only extemporised defences stood between us.
Ooh.
I looked it up, Pete.
What does it mean, Gary?
It means compose or perform without preparation. Haig goes on to say... only extemporised defences stood between us and the Bapaume Ridge. Moreover, the enemy had suffered much in men, in material, and in morale. If we rested even for a month, the enemy would be able to strengthen his defences, to recover his equilibrium, to make good deficiencies, and worse still, would regain the initiative. The longer we rested, the more difficult would be our problem again become. So in my opinion, we must continue to press the enemy to the utmost of our power.
But the Germans did hold on. And what else happens on the Somme in October and November? What could happen any October and November, do you think? And there's no clue in front of you? There's no point looking?
Well, you mean the weather?
Yeah.
Yeah, the weather starts to deteriorate quite quickly.
And that makes artillery less difficult, and it's harder to bring up the shells, the logistics deteriorate, everything goes wrong. So by the beginning of November, what do you think the general mood is in the British Army?
Well, gradually, the priorities of the British High Command had changed as winter approached. Their thoughts turned to the necessity of securing the best possible positions for the winter lines. Hence, the Battle of the Ancre, for example, which
we've just done a podcast of that
on the 13th of November, yeah, and I think it was a very recent podcast.
It was. It seems very recent to me.
Now, Haig, he's worried by the ever-deteriorating ground condition, and he orders that General Sir Hubert Gough's Fifth Army attack should not be launched until the ground conditions were dry enough to let the infantry advance with relative freedom of movement, and thereby, of course, enable them to keep pace with the all-important creeping barrage.
They've got to have good weather forecast for at least 2 days following the assault. And this is when you get the Battle of the Ancre. That's where it takes ages for that to
now,
result.
the end result was a relative success, and the battle it closed down for the British, with the French following, as we said in our podcast, about a month later.
Yeah, they carry on fighting. The Somme is not a British battle. It's an Anglo-French battle. Now, what are the Germans? I think they'd survive by the skin of their teeth, because it isn't just the Somme for them. It's also Verdun, which is a terrific battle. They've got a bit of a gloomy future, haven't they?
They're looking forward to what they see to be inevitable defeat, and you're going to be General Erich Ludendorff of the German HQ.
Yeah, he's the new chief of staff, because Falkenhayn had gone. The Verdun had done for him and the Somme. And I'm going to say this. GHQ had to bear in mind that the enemy's great superiority in men and material would be even more painfully felt in 1917 than in 1916. They had to face the danger that Somme fighting would soon break out at various points on our fronts, and that even our troops would not be able to withstand such attacks indefinitely, especially if the enemy gave us no time for rest and the accumulation of material. Our position was uncommonly difficult and a way out hard to find. We could not contemplate an offensive ourselves, having to keep our reserves available for defence. There was no hope of a collapse of any of the Entente powers. If the war lasted, our defeat seemed inevitable. Economically, we were in a highly unfavourable position for a war of exhaustion. At home, our strength was badly shaken. Questions of the supply of foodstuffs caused great anxiety, and so too did questions of morale. We were not undermining the spirits of the enemy populations with their starvation, blockades and propaganda. The future looked dark. Well, it did. So, in a sense, Haig was right in his idea that the Germans were approaching. They were getting near their limits, but there were signs of deterioration. But he was also wrong. Why was he also wrong?
Well, he's wrong about the Germans' ability as a mighty nation to withstand hardship and loss.
Yeah, I mean, the German state is the biggest, it's probably one of the best economies in the world. The army is huge and probably the best army in the world. They're not going to fall over.
But in that quote, I find it really interesting that he's naming Somme fighting. It's now becoming a description of a type of fighting.
I think you're right. And it is almost the obvious. It's worth remembering that he writes this stuff after the war, and as often. So it's, you've got to realise there's some special.
He also had an agenda, of course, at that time.
He did. He was a funny bloke, wasn't it? Well, it's not funny. There's nothing funny about it. Now, the whole thing about the Somme is that it's not about the stupidity of individuals, really. It's almost the inevitable result when nation states, the great Western powers, start fighting each other, resolve their problems through war. And it's worth remembering, with the active encouragement with most of the civilian population. So what does war demand between the nation states?
Well, it demands that they strain every sinew to defeat each other. War meant the mobilisation of all their men and resources. The very power of the European nation states meant that the numbers of armed men and the powers of destruction they wielded exceeded anything that had been dreamed of in their worst nightmares.
So there's never been anything like this before, have they?
You mentioned Waterloo earlier. The scale of losses, when you compare the two, which are roughly 100 years apart, are incredible. And as soldiers struck down their enemies, this is in 1916, more appeared springing forward from the schools.
The railheads
and
are just the rail. It's worth mentioning. You used to like mentioning the railways. You've forgotten to recently. I don't know why. Possibly you're getting far.
Well, it was the logistics of the time. How did you get everything to that front? The railways played a massive part, as did the railway timetable.
And they're just funneling more divisions to the front quickly and efficiently.
Yeah, killing a few thousand men, it barely dents the manpower resources of the modern industrial state. Millions would be killed, maimed and mentally crippled before one side or the other was so worn down that they couldn't struggle on anymore.
They just couldn't go on. In one sense, the Battle of the Somme, it shows that tactical objectives, which is all we've said there were in the Somme area, in contrast to the Flanders, where Hague wanted to attack, where there are strategic objectives, tactical objectives don't matter at all.
Well, the only objective that really mattered was the long-term destruction of the German army.
So what happens when the Germans want to avoid more Somme fighting? Ludendorff's now in control. Well, Hindenburg is the figurehead. But so what do?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, they voluntarily withdraw to the new Hindenburg lines, which are some miles beyond Bapaume in the spring of 1917.
It's not a coincidence, is it? It's not some whim either. They're shortening their line, which means that they've got more troops per mile of line. And what are they also avoiding?
Well, they're avoiding any imminent renewal of the British and French pressure on the Somme from a tactical position of their own choosing.
Which is, by the way, what the French fundamentally plan and the British for 1917.
Absolutely.
Now, when we look at the Somme, people are so shocked by it. But why is it different from the Second World War?
Well, during the Second World War, it looks as if the British had evaded the brunt of the massive casualties which were rendered inevitable by modern continental war. Yet the butcher's bill's still got to be paid.
Who pays it then?
Well, it's by that time it's the soldiers of the Soviet Union who died in their millions to slowly grind down the forces and will of the German Third Reich over 4 long years.
So it's not our brave lads then. Our brave lads and the Americans play a part, and the bombing and all the rest. But the fundamental reality is...
in the numbers that you associate with the slaughter of the Western Front, it's the Russians.
Now, and what happens when the British... we all have this thing that British generals are better in the Second World War. I don't think they are. I think British generalship's better in the First World War. But what happens when British troops attack the Germans in prepared positions in the Second World War?
Well, they still suffer serious casualties.
Are you talking Normandy here?
Normandy's a great example. There's no back door. There's no painless route map to success. In war, someone always seems to have to suffer.
Yeah, I think whether it be the Russians or yeah. Now, how well did Haig perform on the Somme in 1916?
Well, we started by saying much of the responsibility for the Allied strategy, which was adopted in 1916, wasn't his.
That's French. And
it was French.
Joff.
And he was determined the shape of the Allied strategy in 1916.
He did.
Yes, sorry. But yes, the broad thrust of Haig's Western Front and attritional strategy in 1916 was probably correct.
I think we've gone through some of the mistakes we feel he made. And we're armchair commentators
We've
here.
also gone through some mistakes I've made.
And some mistakes that I've made, Gary. Which are legion, people often say, particularly my colleagues.
As we said, he was new in the job.
Yes, this is a point people forget. He was new in the job. He'd been a lieutenant general in charge of a corps in 1914, and he was now in charge of 5 armies by the end of the Somme.
Which was a larger force than any British commander before, or indeed during the Second World War.
And he was at four armies at the start of the Somme. 5th Army came in during it. I mean, this is a huge step forward, isn't it?
But you've also got to think about, and we touched on it, the rawness of the British divisions.
They were all new, essentially, weren't they?
Yeah, the type and a number of the weapon systems which were available in 1916.
So there was developments in that were to come to lead to the all-arms battle. There's one other thing that we always got to remember, why the British and French, in the end, failed on the Somme. Who's that?
Well, it's the nature of the Germans in defence. It probably meant that failure was inevitable.
In 1916.
Yeah, in 1916.
Yeah, I'd say, but, the British Army is learning, but there's a bit of a fallback to that. Who else is learning?
The Germans.
Bugger. Now, if you've enjoyed this podcast, and I hope you have, then do think of buying us a coffee, but I can't remember how you do that.
Well, we'll put a link up when we advertise the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
It would be helpful because we both like coffee, and in fact, I'm going to go and put it on.
Hooray! Cheers, Gary. Thanks for listening to the show.
Blah, blah, blah.
If you'd like to support us, you can now buy us a coffee. Visit www.buymeacoffee.com/PGMH.
Or visit www.blah.
And we'd be jolly grateful.
Cheers.